Before 1930, power in Brazil had been split between leaders from Minas Gerais and São Paulo. However, when a São Paulo president refused to appoint a candidate from Minas Gerais as his successor, the old coffee with milk policy broke down. This began the 1930 revolution in Brazil, which saw a military coup end the old republic in Brazil and appoint Vargas as president. So power had effectively been stripped away from São Paulo, but it was still one of the most powerful states in Brazil. They had, unlike most of Brazil, a growing industrial sector, a wealthy middle class, and a large European immigrant community, and as they were so wealthy, many saw São Paulo as being tied to the rest of the poorer states in Brazil, so calls for independence grew louder, especially after the 1930 revolution. Plus Vargas, who had been backed by liberals, had promised free elections and to create a new constitution, but these weren't forthcoming right away. However, in order to steer Brazil through the Great Depression, he introduced reforms similar to Roosevelt's New Deal in America. And as a nationalist, he introduced heavy tariffs to grow Brazilian industries and limited immigration. Plus, to overcome Brazil's past problems with decentralization, he implemented a few reforms, hoping to limit state powers, like appointing his own supporters to govern over states for the central government, one of which was João Alberto, who was appointed to govern São Paulo, but he was not even born in the state, which angered many of the locals. Plus, Vargas came into power with the help of the followers of Tenentismo, young military officers who supported a wide range of reforms. However, now that they had removed the old powers, their approach to future reforms were far-ranging. Some, like Luis Carlos Prestes, a prominent leader in the mid-1920s, became a communist, while his old ally, Miguel Costa, created the Revolutionary Legion, an organization that was closer to fascism. And Miguel Costa had also been placed in charge of São Paulo state, militia and police, so the Paulistas. People from São Paulo now had very little say in their own politics, and began to protest in their thousands in 1932. Plus the two opposing political groups in São Paulo, the Democratic and Republican parties, united against this new threat to their power and autonomy. Vargas tried to appease the population by appointing a fellow Paulista, Pedro do Trilho, as governor in March, but his powers were still somewhat limited by the more powerful central government, and the problems escalated when a group of Paulista students stormed the headquarters of the Vargas Revolutionary League. But they were fought back, and 4 of them were killed. Toledo that day effectively broke with the federal government by appointing new cabinet ministers without Vargas's approval, and the initials of the killed students were used for the name of New Revolutionary Organization, MMDC. Then on July 9th, using the call for new constitution as a pretext, the people of São Paulo rose up. They were joined by Maracaju, a state which broke away from Mato Grosso. However, they provided very few men to the revolution. Plus, they had hoped for support from Minister Reyes and Rio Grande do Sul. But except from a few hundred gaucho troops, they remained on the government side. The forces in São Paulo, however, were led by a veteran of the Tenentismo movement, Isidoro Dias Lopes, and a general of the Brazilian army, Bertoldo Klinger. Together, they controlled an army largely made up of military, police, and tens of thousands of volunteers. But despite having some planes and artillery, they lacked guns. The government had much larger forces at its disposal, but suffered from logistical problems. And São Paulo still remained far more industrial and wealthier than the rest of the country. So the Paulistas planned on marching straight on Rio, leaving their western border lightly defended, while the government used their navy to blockade the state. However, with few weapons, the Paulistas had to delay their assault on the capital, giving the government time to fight them back. And both sides began entrenching themselves in the Powell. Isters were then attacked from the north and south, and although they managed to hold the line for a while, the more numerous government troops began pushing them back slowly. So with the state blockaded, the troops ill-equipped, and the government forces shelling cities, the Paulistas were forced to begin the peace process. In early October, Maracaju was retaken by Mato Grosso, and leaders in São Paulo were imprisoned, and many were exiled. But despite being defeated, their calls for a new constitution were met, as one was introduced in 1934, however. This proved to be the shortest constitution in Brazilian history, as in 1937, Fargo staged a self-coup and became a dictator through Estado Novo.